Computer. Hello again. This is Jamie Boudreau with the Louisiana Mississippi Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, and we are very happy to continue this series on trauma-informed care. And today we have the privilege of having Kim Smith, who's the bereavement coordinator and chaplain for Heart of Hospice, which is part of the LHC group, talk to us today about moral injury. Under trauma-informed care, there's moral injury, there's PTSD, and suicide. And we will have one session on each of those topics, and we begin trauma-informed care at the beginning with moral injury and Kim Smith. Thank you, Kim, for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And the screen is mine, huh? This is a little bit different when you do these things virtually. This presentation was originally presented for LMHPCO, the regular annual conference this summer, which we're in the summer of 2023. You may be watching this in years to come, and the information will still remain pretty current, and especially some of the experts that I'm going to mention. Those are people that if you look up, whether it be moral injury or you look up, let's say, Joseph Currier, you're going to still see some information, maybe some more updated. But let's jump into this. I entitled this presentation, Beyond Moral Injury, Recovering the Lost Sense of Self. What in the world is moral injury? Let's kind of begin this. So this is our disclaimer. We just got that out here, and you can read that. And you might want to have your camera and or some sort of screenshot capability ready in case you want to snap a picture of the screens, not this one in particular, but ones as they come up. Years ago, when I joined the Heart of Hospice family, I was about on day 3, and my new boss came to my desk and said, "Would you be willing to do our We Honor Veterans program?" And I always ask, what do you say to your boss of 3 days when they ask you to do anything? Of course you say yes. And I told her, I said, "I love veterans. I don't know anything about We Honor Veterans, but let me see what I can figure out." And now, 8 years later, I'm still in the midst of We Honor Veterans. I've been here, there, and everywhere for Heart of Hospice, and have had the opportunity to speak on veterans issues to multiple different audiences, and the opportunity to speak to corrections. This would be my second time. This presentation is going to be available to those who are volunteering or helping with hospice in the corrections facility, but it is applicable to anyone helping in any way with hospice veteran issues. That handsome soldier boy on your screen there, that's my dad. He served in World War II. And so I have always known about veteran issues, but never did I know. Number one, I didn't even know that people who served in our military were not all a part of the VA system. That was something I learned very early on. I knew nothing about moral injury. I knew nothing about just how many people that more military, but in healthcare, in other areas. And hopefully, as a result of this presentation, you will begin to think about those around you and even yourself, where you might have a moral injury and didn't even know what to name it. So, purpose statement to inform participants of the definitions, and I'll explain that, of moral injury, the differences between moral injury and PTSD, causes and examples of moral injury, military and non-military, treatment options for moral injury. And then you should be able to briefly define moral injury. That's harder than you think. Compare and contrast moral injury and PTSD, provide some of the possible causes of moral injury, describe some examples of the effects of moral injury, and be aware of some of the current treatment options for moral injury. There are certain parts of this that I'm going to focus on more than others, and you're going to understand why. So it's one of the reasons I want you to have a camera ready so you can snap a copy of certain slides, such as the treatment protocols, because we're not going to go into that deeply at all. So when I first did a presentation years ago on moral injury, this particular video, which I'm not going to show because of time and technology issues, this one changed my life. So this is a video that's still out on YouTube. I watched it not too long ago, and it's about a fellow named Marshall Powell. And Marshall Powell, he served as a medic, and he's from the great state of Oklahoma. And he grew up with those middle of the country values. And the video begins with him driving into Zion Cemetery and going to visit the graves of his relatives, as he says, who taught me right from wrong. But when he went overseas and he served, his moral code was challenged in multiple ways, whether it be from seeing civilian deaths to just struggling with the shame of being a part of situations that he wasn't sure how to handle. But one particular day, they brought a young Iraqi girl into the operating room. And when he looked down on this child, something in him just broke. She had received severe injuries as a result of a bombing. And he was overwhelmed by just incredible shame and blame. Even though he personally did not cause harm to her, he knew that what he was a part of had been involved in that, and it just broke him. And so from that point on in his military career, and when he came home, you can pretty much guess what happened. What did he try to do? He tried to numb himself. He used alcohol. He used anything that he could do to try to get away from that deep blame. And he struggled so much with depression. Thankfully, there was a group out in San Diego, California. It's called Oasis. It's at a naval base out there. And in those therapy groups, those therapists understood moral injury and realized that that was what Marshall Powell was dealing with. And one of the assignments that they gave to participants was to write a letter to someone about their moral injury. And Marshall Powell decided to write a letter to the parents of the young Iraqi girl. And it's just heartbreaking when you listen to it. And he writes about just how precious she was and how he knows that they would be so proud of her. In the midst of this was helpful to help him to be able to pour out some of that pain that was inside of him and be able to live healthier after he left the program. The video goes on to talk about the original person who kind of started the conversation about moral injury, and that was Dr. Jonathan Shay. He's a retired VA clinical psychiatrist, and he's going to be mentioned a couple of different times as we go on to the other slides. So what in the world is moral injury? If I were doing the presentation on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, giving a definition would not be difficult. But moral injury, as you're going to see in the chart between PTSD and moral injury is not as cut and dry when it comes to a definition. And the definition over the years has continued to develop. This is a new conversation. And one of the things that I've learned doing a presentation like this over the last few years is there are many in the VA system and in the military who do not believe moral injury is truly a thing. Like they do not agree that this is something that people in the military struggle with, nor do they need any kind of treatment for it. So as a result, the whole idea of moral injury has continued to develop. When Jonathan Shay first coined the term, the definition was a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in high stakes situations. He wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, and as he was dealing with Vietnam veterans, he just kept seeing that, yes, many of them had post-traumatic stress disorder, but he also saw this soul wound of them. And there wasn't any type of literature, there wasn't any conversation specific about that. And that's where moral injury started to develop and started to be a part of the conversation. He goes on to say at some point, the soul wound inflicted by doing what violates one's own ethics, ideals, or attachments. And I could literally give you, I could give you probably 25 different definitions of moral injury. Jonathan Shea, again, in one of the videos, he says, the state in which people are certain that all possibility of virtue has deserted their lives. And each of these are correct to some degree. As a result of his work, Brett Litz, Stein, Delaney, and Shira McGinn is the name at the end there, and some of their colleagues really have done tremendous research about moral injury, treatment protocols. They work for the VA and have, in my opinion, given the most concise definition. I won't say that they've solved the problem of defining, but here you go: perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. If I had to hang my hat on one, that would be the one that I would hang my hat on. A couple of different variations. Here we go. This is just kind of a visual representation. So we're talking acts of commission, things that someone did that caused their moral compass to be shifted. Acts of omission, where they felt like they should have done something. Maybe in the midst of the event, they didn't think that they should do, but as they come back to the States and they've looked at it from maybe a different perspective, the perspective of which they would have had before they joined the military, they see, oh, I really should have stepped in this situation, or bearing witness to acts. This right here, Tom Voss, co-author of Where War Ends. I have this compass, and it's here for a reason. For me, this is such a great metaphor for what moral injury may look like inside of somebody. Moral injury is when someone witnesses or participates or fails to act against the events which conflict with their moral scaffolding or moral compass. You can see that the definition is very similar to that of Brett Litz and crew, but it adds in this whole idea of a moral compass. So we all know that when you have a compass, true north is set. But when it comes to our moral compass, it's not as set on true north, but it's set on where you believe the moral line is. And that's different for different people. And for Marshall Powell, growing up in Oklahoma, he went into the military with what he felt like was a very strong sense of right or wrong. And he got there and things just shifted, because he said, in the video, he talks about, you taught me right from wrong, but when I was over there, I couldn't do it that way. And you get into all of these variations of gray and this whole idea of a moral compass. And whenever that moral compass is shifted, that's when moral injury may occur. And then this example, so Joseph Currier, I mentioned him at the very beginning. He also works for the VA, and there are episodes of a podcast. It's called Headspace and Timing, and I recommend it. It's no longer in publication, but if you go on the net, you will find episodes of it. And there are multiple ones about moral injury, which include Shira McGinn, Dr. Ed Tick, who I'll mention later, and then Dr. Joseph Currier. But he likens moral injury to the whole idea of the Tin Man. Pretty much all of us have seen The Wizard of Oz, and we understand that the Tin Man was struggling so much because he didn't have a heart. And many people who struggle with moral injury believe that their heart no longer works. And that if people really saw them and saw how they now see the world, they would never love them. And so that plays into the whole moral injury idea. I bring up soul injury. Soul injury is an expanded topic. It does include moral injury, but it is much broader. So somebody who may have a soul injury might be a child that has been through extreme trauma, and as a result, they do not see the world as they did before. This is by Deborah Grassman and the organization called Opus Peace. An overlooked, unassessed wound that separates one from their real self, that causes a person to feel personally defective, inadequate, or unworthy. And then, so looking at that, and now what are the differences and what is alike between moral injury and PTSD? So post-traumatic stress disorder is fear-based, changes your brain. It doesn't mean it changes your brain permanently. There are some therapies now that help to kind of rewire the brain, but it is about fear-based. Moral injury is based in moral judgment, and having it requires a working conscience. So even though there are similarities between them, there are drastic differences. So here you go. We have moral injury on the left. We have the information in the middle that is often associated with both. And we have PTSD on the right. I'm going to mention the middle ground here. Ones that may occur with both: reminders, avoidance, denial, intrusive thoughts, sleep issues, substance use, negative cognition such as guilt, shame, anger, disgust, betrayal, negative view of self, and then social problems, trust issues, spiritual changes, fatalism of sorrow. Some of them are more leaning toward the moral injury side, but people with PTSD may also experience them. On the right side, it talks about with PTSD, these are more likely to be related to life-threatening events, more likely to re-experience the event, to have that hyper arousal, because again, it was fear-based and it was a trauma that occurred that changed the wiring of the brain. And then avoidance, trying to prevent re-injury. There's much more research about PTSD. There's more consensus as to what PTSD is, what it is not, and it has a much broader focus. Whereas we've got moral injury, it's less likely to be related to life-threatening events. There's more of a spiritual focus. It's more about who am I. Avoidance is not as much trying to protect themselves, but wishing to protect others from the person that they think they are. There's much less research, much less consensus, and an narrower focus. When I first did this presentation for the social workers of the VA of New Orleans, the day that COVID hit the VA hospital back in 2020, I found some research. By the time I was digging in to do this presentation again in early 2023, the research base had grown quite a bit. And I would expect that if I do this same presentation in about 5 years, we're going to have a whole lot more out there, because there's so much growth, because people are realizing this really is a thing. It is something that matters, and we can really change the world if we learn more about it and we figure out ways to help people. How moral injury might manifest itself. So here's one of the things to try to help us understand. So Volunteers of America, they have an entire section of what they do that is devoted to moral injury. They spent the money, they hired one of the top experts on moral injury, that being Rita Brock, and they have the Shea Moral Injury Center, and you can guess that is related to Dr. Jonathan Shea. It says there's no predictable set of causes, but there are experiences that create a risk for moral injury. I'll use the PTSD example again. We all experience trauma in our life. All of us experience traumatic experiences, but not all of us develop the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Similar with moral injury. Two people can have the same experience happen, and even though it may shake them, it doesn't have to necessarily shake their moral compass to a place where, it's one thing if I shake this, It's another thing if when I shake it, it goes back to true north versus when I shake it, it is not sure where true north is anymore. That's kind of the difference between. And so this idea of PMIEs, those are potentially morally injurious events. In other words, things that happen to you in front of you that you do that might cause a moral injury, but it will very well cause moral pain. Situations which occur in high stakes environments where one's moral code or values are violated, such as in the context of war or killing of a child. Moral pain. These PMIEs cause moral pain. Moral pain often includes moral emotions such as guilt, shame, disgust, anger, and contempt, as well as the cognitions associated with blaming oneself. In other words, the thoughts. Examples of PMIEs in war. So I've got about 3 pages of these. And as you hear me read these off, I want you to think about how this might not only shake someone's moral compass, but might cause it to not be able to find true north again. Using deadly force in combat and causing the harm or death of civilians knowingly, but without alternatives or accidentally. Giving orders in combat that result in the injury or death of a fellow service member. Failing to provide medical aid to an injured civilian or service member. A change in belief about the necessity or justification of war during or after one's service. Returning home from deployment and hearing the executions of cooperating local nationals. Failing to report knowledge of sexual assault or rape committed against oneself, a fellow service member, or civilians. I've got to pause. Even though this presentation is not about sexual assault, it's not about women veterans, we do have a presentation that is going to be about that. And I encourage you to tune in because moral injury can definitely occur in these situations, whether you are the person who received the abuse or someone who perpetrated the abuse, knew about the abuse, knew about a way to stop it and did not, and on we go. And then following orders that were illegal, immoral, and or against the rules of engagement or the Geneva Convention. I'm moving this just so I can see a little bit better here. And this is from Norman and McGinn. Freezing or failing to perform a duty during a dangerous or traumatic event, such as falling asleep on patrol, engaging in or witnessing acts of disproportionate violence, feeling nothing or exhilaration, which while causing harm or killing others. And there are many, 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 many more of these. Whenever I did this presentation for the VA social workers, I divided them up into tables. And at this point in the presentation, I asked them what are some experiences that you have heard about which could cause moral injury. And, you know, I'd already given the examples that are on here, and they sat at their tables and they thought about the different veterans that they had opportunity to meet over the years. And they came up with just a very diverse group of ideas of ways that moral injury had occurred, some of which were not about the combat situation, but they were about how people were treated in the midst, just the interpersonal aspects of the military service. And you know, I ask you at this point, you can't answer me, you can't like put in the chat a answer, but I want you to think, what are some other causes of moral injury, whether it be military or whether it be outside the military? The whole COVID experience led to moral injury for many physicians, nurses, and other healthcare workers. I worked in a COVID unit, and I cannot tell you how many people died in front of me and how often I was confronted with death. It changes you. And that's just one of the many examples that has happened over the last few years that can cause moral injury in healthcare. But where have you seen in your life moral injury occur. And since this presentation is specifically being recorded for corrections, I breathe in hard there because moral injury happens in the corrections environment so often. So somebody may be a veteran and they may have experienced some of those PMIEs in the military service. And maybe it caused moral injury, maybe it caused moral pain. But then they carry that into the corrections environment. Possibly they violated the laws of the land because of the moral injury that they had experienced and the compass being thrown off. Just want you to think about that. If this presentation accomplishes nothing else, I want you to spend some time thinking about the people that you know and how this applies to them. Next. So this moral injury story. I had mentioned Deborah Grassman and Opus Peace earlier on. I've learned so much from her and the trainings over the years, but there was a story that just grabbed hold of me and I could never forget. The text of the story is no longer online, but there is a YouTube video and you can snap a picture there and see the information. I have the bullet points here of this story, but I'm going to try to go down through it pretty quickly. But the fellow's name was Paul Schutte. Sadly, he died from the first time I heard this presentation until I did this presentation a little while ago. He had died, I think it was 2021, as a result of a house fire. But his story will always live on because of the impact that it has had. To say that he had moral injury, there is no doubt. So he was drafted in November 14th of 1967. He was a sophomore at Ohio State University. He said, I was young, I was innocent, I was naive and clueless. He went to basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. And he said, I was about to be tested. My morals, my values, my masculinity, my body, my soul were all at risk. He said he brought to the experience his Midwestern values. He'd been taught to be kind to others, to be nice, to be compassionate. And when he first got to basic training, he thrived at first because he was good at doing excellence. And so he has his gun and he is shooting at the target and everything is good until they put up a human target. And when they put up a human target, and it clicked into this young man's mind what he was being trained to do, something inside of him just snapped. And he just felt inside of himself that he could not do this. He wanted to serve his country, but he just believed that there was no way that he could kill another human being. It caused him so much moral distress. He was working in the kitchen at the time, and he took his hands and put them in scalding water so that he could not hold a gun. Of course, his commanding officer was not happy with him, but they did let him become a medic. And that is how he shipped off to Vietnam. He got a one-way ticket. He became a medic and a surgical tech. He said, for the next 15 months, I saw the horror of war, death, mutilation, and suffering. He was often covered in blood. He said, my soul screaming, desperate to find some meaning in this unholy carnage. He said, I saw the extremes of humanity. And you see the bright yellow in the top left corner. So for many of you, you saw the TV show MASH. That's the best example that I can give from a fictional standpoint of what Paul Schutte described as his big yellow hooch. He and a couple of his buddies, they painted their quarters bright yellow in order to try to bring some sort of beauty, if you would, or less ugly to their situation. And it was very similar to what you see on the MASH TV show, where this was a place where they all connected. They came together to commiserate to spend time together, to support each other. He said, but as time went on, his buddies, one at a time, would head back to the States. They would finish their time there. And he decided to extend his stay for 3 months. He said, with each departure, a piece of my soul departed too. He became obsessed with his role as a medic. But one day, a blonde, strapping 19-year-old fella came in to the operating room from Texas. The guy was conscious and he was gently pleading for Paul to not let him die. The room was loud as it was always. And then the young man died. And Paul said that it seemed as though the whole place went silent. The surgeon looked at him and told him to finish up. And they left him alone there. And in the midst of that, something just snapped inside of him. He let out this guttural sound. And then there was silence. Of course, they came to check on him, and that was the last time he was allowed in the operating room, because they knew that at that point, a part of him was gone. He went ahead and finished out his tour in Vietnam. He said it was a blur. He said, I left Vietnam on June 22nd, 1970. I wept as the Jeep pulled away from the Yellow Hooch. I was numb and soulless. And he spent his next 14 years wandering, and as he described it, just trying to find himself, trying to find his soul. During that time, he lived in 10 different places, had 11 different jobs, had 6 significant relationships, and traveled to 20 different countries. He said one day, as he was sitting on a beach, it happened. His soul returned. And he went on to have a very successful career. He was a professor and was able to move past, or I don't know if the word past is correct. He was able to move forward with the experience as part of him. He said that he would not trade his experience in Vietnam for anything, nor would he wish it on anyone. And that's just one example of a moral injury story. But for me, it's one that just, it's helped me to put a face on the idea of moral injury. These are the sections we're going to move through quickly. Assessing moral injury. Here are 5 different types of questionnaires. And again, here's where you might want to snap a picture and go out and look at the information. Look at the source down below, because it tells a little bit about each of them. Some of them look at the events that people had occur. Some of them ask more questions about how people are handling the events that they have experienced. And then the possible interventions. Here's one of the snapshots. This is called the 7 C's of Stress First Aid. This came from a presentation, which I highly recommend that you can see online. It's called Community Hospices, Moral Injury in Vietnam Veterans. But Dr. Bruce and Dr. Watson, they do a phenomenal job of talking about moral injury. And here are multiple others that are VA treatments. Some of these are PTSD treatments that have been adapted to be more specific about moral injury. Some of them are specific to moral injury. Again, this field is adapting and growing. Outside of the VA, Volunteers of America, as I said earlier, has a strong emphasis on moral injury. And so when I first did this presentation in 2020, they were experimenting with a program that they called Resilient Strength Training. And for 2017 to 2019, they piloted it. And as you can see, it has things in it such as writing, art, music, deep listening, guided meditation, trauma sharing, and calming spiritual practices. And I want to share treatments that are not just part of the VA system. I do not know in corrections what you have ability to get your hands on, if you can get your hands on some of the VA treatment protocols, or if you need to reach out to one of these other organizations. Wounded Warrior Project. So I reached out to them. They have a project called Project Odyssey. And specifically, it is a 12-week mental health program that is adventure-based and deals with PTSD. But I specifically wrote them, and their response to me about moral injury, it says, our Project Odyssey has components in the plan to address moral injury. And even though this wouldn't be able to be specifically done in corrections, it does not mean that you couldn't take some of the components and be able to adapt them. Then soul injury. So Opus Peace, Deborah Grassman, they have a soul injury institute training. Years ago, it was done in person, but now it can be done virtually. And so you can go to the Opus Peace website and learn more about that. And again, it's not just the moral injury component, but it is soul injury. But I'm not a gambling person, but I could just like make a major bet that many, many, many people who are incarcerated have soul injuries. And that could have contributed to the choices that they made. This is the one part of this presentation that I added specifically because of corrections. When I was doing my research and I was watching multiple different videos, I came upon this fellow named Ron Self. So Ron Self served in the military, was decorated, but he made a really poor choice after he left the military. And that led to him being incarcerated for, if I remember correctly, maybe 23 years. In the midst of it, because he was in such a bad way himself, he was in such emotional and mental darkness. As he began to look around him, he's like, there has to be a way to help. There has to be a way to help. While he was incarcerated, he began this program that's now called Veterans Healing Veterans. And you can find this online, veteranshealingveterans.com. And as a result, in the state of California, there are multiple different variations of this program that they have seen really good results with. And so there is something specific for correction. So closing stories. Dr. Ed Tick on the Headspace and Timing podcast, he did not serve in the military, but he spent a lot of time helping those who have served in the military, and he takes regular trips. At this time, he was taking yearly trips to Vietnam. His father-in-law at age 95 was struggling with dementia. But one of the things that his father-in-law was carrying forward, he was around at the time of World War II. And one of the few things that was really strong in his mind in his last days was thinking about after World War II, because he was part of the cleanup crew. And he just kept asking, did so many Japanese have to die for me to have this life? He was thankful for his life, but he had such regret as to what had occurred. The second story has to do with the Vietnam trip. So one of the trips to Middle East, as in veterans who served in the Middle East, went to Vietnam to support their brethren and just to see what it was like. And as they looked around and they saw the healing that occurred, they looked at their Vietnam veteran counterparts and said, well, one of the things that we learned is we're not going to spend like 50 years in the midst of this pain. We're going to do our work now. We're not going to wait all these years and carry all of this around. He also tells this story that is just heartbreaking. There was this Native American Vietnam veteran, and he had been taught warriorhood as part of his Native American culture. And so he understood that you have to kill as part of the battle, but he had a ritual that he had been taught to do over somebody that you had killed. And so the very first time he was standing face to face against a Vietnamese soldier, and the two of them were just looking at each other, The other soldier did not fire. The Native American fella did, and his enemy went down. And he went over to do this death ritual over the fallen Vietnamese veteran. And his commanding officer went nuts on him and told him absolutely not. As a result, this Native American veteran just shut down at that time. When he came back to the States, he was absolutely a problem for his entire community until he went back to Vietnam and they went to the exact spot where he had killed that guy. And he did that death ritual and found such healing that he went back to his Native American community and became not only a functioning member, but a leader in the community. You can check out veteranmentalhealth.com for more. And then Deborah Grassman again. So she had the opportunity to sit with over 10,000 dying veterans. And one of them asked, "Do you have any idea how many men I have killed?" And she said a simple prayer over the veteran. And in the midst of it, the guy died like the next day. It was as if all of these years and all of the pain and the shame and the guilt he had carried, the fact that he thought he could be forgiven by his creator changed everything. You can check out online her anchoring heart technique. It is something that could be done in corrections with no problem and has been very successful. And then the unmourned losses and fallen comrade ceremony could also be used. So, parting thoughts. When you are trying to help somebody with moral injury, do realize that they may tell you stories that are going to shake your moral compass, possibly. But try as best you can to be fully present and try to truly see the human being behind those eyes. And you may have to overcome your own prejudices. There may be things that they say or do that will tempt you to run away. But if you can stay in there with them, you may change the life of another human being. And I end with the starfish story. Can being there for one person really make a difference? A young man is walking along the ocean and sees a beach on which thousands and thousands of starfish have washed ashore. Further along, he sees an old man walking slowly and stooping off and picking up one starfish after another and tossing each one gently into the ocean. "Why are you throwing starfish into the ocean?" he asked. "Because the sun is up and the tide is going out, and if I don't throw them further in, they will die." "But old man, don't you realize there are miles and miles of beach and starfish all along it? You can't possibly save them all. You can't even save 1/10 of them. In fact, even if you work all day, your efforts won't make any difference at all." The old man listened calmly and then bent down to pick up another starfish and threw it into the sea. It made a difference to that one. And that is my challenge to you. Set out to make a difference in at least one human being's experience. Here's my email address, kimberly.smith4@lhcgroup.com. And that is the end of our presentation. I will hand it back over to Jamie.
Kim, I just want to thank you again for an incredibly insightful presentation on moral injury. I've learned so much just from listening to this one presentation, and it struck me how applicable your comments are in just about every setting, whether it's in the military or in corrections or in our homes in the free world. I mean, there's application for hospice professionals to understand their patients, a lot better by understanding this issue of moral injury, because I think there's a lot of moral injury in this world today. And I really want to thank you for sharing your insights with the rest of us on this topic. Um, we will uh, we will also have there are other series on trauma-informed care that will be presented on PTSD and on suicide in the coming weeks. So um, thank you for listening to today's session, and we look forward to having you join us in the We Honor Veterans program. Thank you again, Kim. Bye-bye.
We finished? We got it?